Hello everyone and welcome to WCN World News. I'm Andy Klein. Well, Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies just released their strategic plan on how to deal with China over the ongoing dispute over the Senkaku Islands, or in Chinese, Diaoyu. Both countries claim sovereignty over the uninhabited islands, which are rich in fishing resources as well as natural gas. So what is Japan's plan on how to deal with this ongoing crisis? Well, to explain it is the NIDS's Masayuki Masuda, and he will be followed up by a question and answer session in which WCN gets in a question of our own. Stay tuned.
This time, my team decided to more focusing on that so-called crisis management issues, or the Chinese crisis management behavior itself. So let me start with the why my team has decided to pick up these issues. Last few years, especially the last 5 years, so many specialists in this region, also policymakers, started to discuss about China's assertiveness in external behavior. For example, one of the keywords for the China's assertiveness would be the core interest of China. Actually, Chinese leaders already started this kind of terms, core interest. But before the 2008 or 9, Chinese leaders just mentioned the core interest in terms of the Taiwan issues, especially in its relations with the United States. The tone of the statement by China at the time is just very simple. China always tried to appeal to the United States that Taiwan is a part of the mainland China. Taiwan issue, a domestic agenda, also belong to the China's core interest. That's all. But from the year of I think that in the autumn of 2008, typically speaking, from 2009, China strengthened its claims on the core interest argument. For example, China demands to respect its core interest through the concrete action, not only just to the United States, but also Japan and the regional countries. Also, not just only focusing on the Taiwan issues, but also mention that the maritime interest, maritime rights and interest in both South China Sea and East China Sea since 2009. Also, Chinese authorities started to strengthen its so-called rights protection wetland activities in the East and South China Sea. Chinese government decided to introduce the regular patrol activities by the law enforcement agencies in 2007 and 2008. I think that the regional countries, including Japan and the some Southeast Asian countries, started to realize that the increasing opportunity of the crisis might happen with China. So this is one reason my team decided to pick up the issue of crisis management with China. But the next question would be that is it possible to have a crisis management mechanism with China? That's a very much fundamental question we really have got today, because on one hand, Chinese government and Chinese leaders, as I mentioned, started to strengthen the so-called national core interest arguments, and also strengthen the rights protection activities in the oceans. But on the other hand, Chinese diplomatic authorities always mention the importance of the win-win relations with the neighboring countries. But how we should understand this contradictory posture, harsh and flexible stance? I think that we can have two different explanations. One is that given the recent increase in number of the Chinese actors that influence the Chinese decision-making in the party, in the government, but So as a result of the increased number of the actors in the Chinese foreign and security policy, Chinese leadership, party leadership, might lose the capability to control so many actors. In other words, lack of governance. So let me start talking about that China's mechanism, decision-making mechanism itself first. As I said, China, in China, you can easily imagine that increasing informal actors that influence the China's decision-making, such as think tanks, specialists, and large companies, and also others, internet and websites, opinion, and others. But, as I said, foreign and security policy, and everything, decision-making process, highly centralized to the Politburo and its standing committee. And in 2001, Chinese leadership, party leadership, after having the incident, has got several meetings to decide guidelines and initial policy lines for 3 days. So under the collective leadership system, Chinese decision making would take it's going to take some times. It's quite difficult for us to get access to the Chinese leaders and leadership before they decided the guidelines and the policy lines. I just argue that recent situation related to the China's Coast Guard, maritime law enforcement agencies. Everybody already knows that last March at the National People's Congress, Chinese government decided to consolidate its maritime law enforcement agency. Before the consolidations, China has got 5 dragons. Somebody also mentioned that 5, 9, or more than 10 dragons. So many dragons there. But at the time, Chinese government decided to have to consolidate the maritime law enforcement agencies. The 4 dragons become 1. 4 means that maritime CMS, China Maritime Surveillance, under the former SORA, and the Coast Guard belong to the Public Security, Ministry of Public Security, FREC under the Ministry of Agriculture, and some police department of the General Administration of Customs. These 4 actors become 1 in the new State Oceanic Administration. This new Oceanic Administration would conduct the law enforcement activities in the oceans under the banner of the China Coast Guard. My team discussed the concept itself, a Chinese concept of the crisis or the crisis management. First, we should stress that the Chinese aim of the crisis management or crisis behavior. Now, what is a crisis means? You know, everybody believes that crisis management is believed to be defined as an action to remove some crisis or the risks, not to escalate the situation into a military dimension. That's one part of China's concept. But on the other hand, China tried to change the situation in the crisis or emergent situations. Try to change the situation in China's favor. So China tried to maximize its national interest in the crisis behavior. That's a bit. It's not unique only to the China, but the Chinese argument. If you read the Chinese papers and academic journals, everybody stressed this part of the concept of crisis management. In the actions, Chinese crisis behavior, Chinese specialists believe that they should purchase some conflicting goal. not necessarily conflicting to the Chinese people, but seems to be conflicting for us, outsiders. For example, in the case of the very important issues related to the, for example, maritime interest or national sovereignty, China always tried to push the very hard line, especially related to that sovereignty affairs. But on the other hand, China tried, in order to preserve its basic position or stance on the sovereignty issue, China sometimes showed that very flexible behavior or the actions. Second character is that legitimacy and initiative. That means that how China defined the crisis or how China defined that kind of emergent situation is important aspect of China's crisis management behavior. China always put itself as a passive victim who is wrong. It's not because of China. It's, for example, the Senkaku issues that Japan or the United States or other countries, other countries. If, for example, Japan or the other country is bad guys, China actions, behavior is always right, So has got the legitimacy. Try to appeal its legitimacy in the reaction to the crisis. The third part is what kind of methods means China would have in reaction to the crisis or the emergent situations. Of course, military means, but Chinese tendency to choose that what kind of methods they're going to take is that try to balance the multiple means, not only just the military, but also political, economical, and foreign diplomatic means as well. First lesson is that how to ensure the emergency communication with China. There is always problematic, especially for us, our side. As I mentioned, Chinese decision-making process is very much highly centralized. It's quite difficult to have a constant access to the not only to the top leaders, but also to the working sections, including diplomatic authority and PRA, before top leaders decided the guideline to react the crisis or incident. Second phase of the analysis in this part is that how China tried to prevent the military accident itself. One of the famous framework is the U.S.-China MMCA, Military Maritime Consultation Agreement. Now, since that year of 1998, China and United States has discussed about how to share the safety standard of the military operations in the peacetime. But to some degree, they come to some consensus about the concept of the communication or what kind of methods, the channel they're going to use on the ground. But Chinese side, especially since the year of 2000 or 2001, China tried to pursue another goals at the MMC meeting. There is China tried to restrain the Americans' military activities in China's EEZ. But if Chinese Navy or armed forces has got conduct some kind of harassment activity against the Americans or the other countries' military activity in China's EEZ, that means that the possibility of the crisis or the possibility of a military accident will gonna increase. So in the year of 2001, Chinese top leader decided to introduce a new policy, that is, obstacle missions was shifted from the PLA Navy to the Maritime Law Enforcement Agency at that time. So in these terms, it is very much important to be addressed how we can share the safety standards, not only just with the military and the PLA, but also how we create access to the China's Coast Guard is one of the important policy issues, not only just for China, United States, but also the other regional countries, including Japan. Crisis management with China is possible. But what kind of crisis management would be possible? That is just prevent the situation escalating into the military dimension. That is a crisis management. That kind of crisis management would be possible. But still difficult for us restraining China's pursuance of its own interest, political interest. Some professors, some analysts and policymakers discussing that crisis management should be just manage not only the military dimension of the crisis, but also the political dimension. Yeah, it's true, but it's quite difficult for us to restrain China's pursuance of the interest. As I mentioned several times here, we should establish a crisis management mechanism between Tokyo and Beijing. Everybody focusing on that military affairs. Yeah, actually, both sides already come to a consensus about the context of the so-called maritime communication mechanism. But as I said, how we can share the safety standards of the operations with Chinese new Coast Guard is also important to be addressed in the Japan security relations. In this time, I think that our security relations with China will be more multi-layered mechanism we're going to have in the future. I'll stop here. I'm looking forward to having a question and comment. Thank you very much.
My name's Andy Klein. I'm with WCN-tv.com. And I'm just wondering, both the Abe administration and China have made arguably hawkish moves to bolster their military and defense. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of compromise that could be reached between China and Japan. It seems like this is a winner-take-all situation. And is it? And if it's not, what kind of compromise would Japan be willing to consider?
Compromise. Yeah, both of the countries, both leaders, it's quite difficult for both of them, Abe-san or the Xi Jinping or the Chinese party leadership to take a new step, that new step which has got some image to the public, domestic people believes that compromising or something. Compromising image is very risky. So it is quite difficult to compromise something on something important things or what to say. But anyway, I don't have a direct, clear-cut answer to your questions, but I think that this report also mentioned, not only just only talking about the Sino-Japanese relations, but in terms of the crisis management, I think that we should. The report also stressed the importance of the direct communication. Yes, but not only just a track one government relations, but also a track two private based or the track 1.5. Track one consultation also important, especially in terms of to start something new things or the conduct something important things. But track one, track 1.5, track 2, and informal, every aspect of the communication or that contact will be very much important. I really want to stress that this part. Also, track one contact should be, especially in Japan, should be open to public, right? But recent situation is very sensitive. So, and Japan is a democratic country. Everything open to the public and the media. So even if China expected that informal closed track one meeting, but it's almost impossible for Japan to say yes, close is okay, but sometimes everything is open to the media and the public. So I think sometimes risky. So I think that 1.5, 2, and open, closed, every activity is also, we should stress the importance of every aspect of the communication.
Mike Fern from CCTV. We've had regular standoffs with the Japanese Coast Guard and the Chinese Coast Guard near the Senkaku Islands ever since the Japanese government nationalized them. At the same time, when we had this balloonist attempting to land on the island, apparently there was some behind-the-scenes negotiation that the Chinese asked the Japanese Coast Guard not to charge him. They took him in and released him. Do you get the sense that the confrontations are sort of managed crisis, but when there is a genuine possibility of things getting out of control, that common sense kicks in?
Thank you very much for giving me a very difficult question to answer. But anyway, I try to do my best. Coast Guard is the police agency. Any activities by the Coast Guard, one of the basis of the activities of them would be the borderline. So it's quite difficult for both, especially for Japanese, to, for example, if both sides agreed to start some discussion, crisis management discussions between the Coast Guard, China would request Japanese side, for example, to reduce the number of the patrol activities in the territorial waters or some around the Senkaku or something. But it is almost impossible for us to stop the patrol activities in the territorial water. So I think that my point is that how to share the safety standard. This sharing a safety standard, or for example, communication mechanism or something like that, is not necessarily directly related to that borderline, right? So I think that we should, we should handle the situation related to the Senkaku is very much important. But between the Coast Guard or the navies and armed forces, not necessarily that directly related to the how we should understand the borderline or the existence of the conflict or some others. We should have a more general discussion between the agency, the government department. So we should not only just focusing on that the Senkaku or that Senkaku issues.
Okay, yes, Joel.
Joël Lejean, RTL France. A simple question. Apparently the Chinese don't want to speak with the Japanese authorities and those issues that you've been mentioning. To your understanding, how long time is it going to be, and what could Japan do for trying to figure out a better situation? Is it by refusing to go to Yasukuni or something like that, or is there something more sophisticated? You talk about multi-layered crisis management, for example.
My simple answer is please ask that question to Abe-san and Xi Jinping. And but anyway, I think that I'm sorry, I'm just a China expert. I'm sorry, I would like to explain the Chinese understanding about your questions. I think that the Chinese always mention that any development of the practical relations, such as defense exchange or military diplomacy and the working level contact, should be based upon that political relations or something like that. So it's quite difficult for them means that, for example, policy actors, departments, including a PLA, to initiate the relation development process fast. I think that we should have some discussion at the highest level, top political leaders. But this year, I think it is a very much good timing for top leaders of the Japan and China to have a direct contact, because China would chair the APEC meeting in Beijing this, I think, September. And also, this region also has got so many multilateral meetings and conferences, including the ARF or Japan, China, South Korean trilateral meetings. So many parties we're going to have, especially starting from that, I think, summer. I think that the APEC, Beijing APEC meeting will be one of the chance for us to have some kind of direct discussion talks between the Prime Minister Abe and Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang. I think that it's quite possible.
It's a very, very simple question, actually. It's a definition of crisis.
Yeah.
And you assume this is defined in China as a crisis. It could be a strategy. You might be defining the whole thing from your point of view and missing the whole, maybe the dimension of the thing. Have you ever considered that this could not be actually a crisis management issue in China, but it's a strategy on their side?
Well,
It's a crisis for Japan, but it may not be a crisis in China. So the whole thing, that the decision making, that there might be a chaos, and when there's a crisis, they can't really react and they try to contain the situation. But it doesn't have to be that way. They might be playing along, but it doesn't have to be that way. Have you ever considered that?
Yeah.
And what would be your strategy or solution to the whole thing? Thank you.
Yeah, very, very good question. And actually, in a drafting process, my team always discuss about such kind of things. We just try to study the crisis management issues with China. But on the other hand, China, for China, it's not a crisis management, issue for China related to, for example, Senkaku issues. Try to pursue that maximize its own interest. So actually, this report stressed the importance of crisis management. But on the other hand, also try to explain that China's crisis behavior or something. So it is quite difficult to share the concept of the crisis management between China and Japan and China and the Southeast countries in the recent situations. But still, both sides, I think that it could agree of the importance of the crisis management in terms of the not to escalate dimension situation into the military dimensions. Actually, on one hand, China, for example, released that to set up air aegis, air zone, right? Defense zone or something. From a Japanese point of view, this is an escalation process, escalation actions by China. But we should carefully watch that what sometimes China's actions is from Japan's point of view is escalation behavior, but politically, economically, and military, I think several dimensions they would have. So I'm sorry, I don't have a clear-cut answer to your questions, but still, we should carefully watch that dimension of the crisis or the dimension of the situation or dimension of the escalation. Thank you.
And let me confirm that China start to build the 4 carriers or Kokubokan. And do you think that China will have the 2 sets of carrier storage groups or Kubo Kido Butai. Okay, so they will have it within 10 years in near future.
Thank you very much. As for the aircraft carrier battle groups, possible battle group of China, I think that it is quite difficult to build such kind of battle group that United States has. Russia, former Soviet Union, also failed to having the American type of the battle group of the aircraft, right? Also, technologically speaking, it is quite difficult to having that aircraft, the set of the aircraft itself is also, technically speaking, it's still difficult for the China. So that's the why China purchased the old aircraft from other countries more than 10 or 20 years ago, right? Now also in terms of hardware, operation or something, it's still difficult to. Today, actually, Liaoning, aircraft carrier Liaoning, you can find some specialists mentioned that this is an aircraft carrier. Yeah, it's a kind of aircraft carrier, but for scientific research or something. So it's gonna take so many times and the budget, the money to having that just only one aircraft battle group. Right? Oh, I think that it is quite difficult, and I would say it's almost impossible to having such kind. You now mentioned such kind of very big battle group.
For a little over a year now, we've had a new prime minister who seems to be very focused here in Japan. He seems to be very focused on China and these foreign policy issues. He calls it proactive pacifism, but it's seen by many others as being much more kind of aggressive and military-focused sort of policies, including changing the budget for the Ministry of Defense and other things like this. What kinds of reactions have you been sensing in changes in the Chinese approach, in sort of reaction to the rise of the Abe administration and its different approach to these issues?
Let me just explain that situation in China in terms of the academic field, especially focusing on Japan's defense studies or something. But it's very much few professors and professionals who really studying on the Japanese defense issues. But very few people, but the fundamental question for China and also for us, when Japanese defense and security policy started to change, it's not because of the Abe administration or the recent LDP government, right? Noda-san already tried to change something, very sensitive issues, believed sensitive issues in their administration, right? So when DPJ government started in summer 2009, Chinese argument about the Japanese security and defense policy is try to put more emphasis on that continuity of the Japanese defense policy. Continuity means that Japanese general trends is that try to put emphasis on the Japanese general trend of the change, but not necessarily go to the military country or something, under the banner of normal country argument or something. So I think that when Abe-san Abe-san came into power at the end of the 2012, very moderate argument you can easily find in the Chinese paper and academic journals. Abe has got the two faces. One is actually you now mentioned that a very more conservative face, but on the other hand, a more realistic. First Abe administration, after became Abe-san became a prime minister. His first foreign country to visit is China. both sides agreed to set up building strategy, mutual beneficial relation based upon the strategic interest or something, you know. So some part of the Chinese scholars put more emphasis on this realistic phase of the Abe-san, but recently, you know, actually after the Abe-san visit to Yasukuni, you know, this is very much sensitive for China, I believe. So put some argument more focusing on that conservative phase of the Abe. But I believe that some school of thought in China has got a moderate view about the Abe-san's realistic stance or part of the realistic stance, and also try to find some possibility to change the recent situation to a more better ways, you know. No, for example, as I said, China would chair the APEC meeting in autumn, I think in September this year in Beijing. Now, if China cannot have any meetings with the Abe-san, that's not only fair for the Japanese side, but also China would lose their face, right? You know. So I think that some part of the Chinese specialists already started to talking about the possibility to develop that to recover their relation with Tokyo.
That was National Institute for Defense Studies' Masayuki Masuda talking about how Japan plans to manage the ongoing crisis with China over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. It sounded like their plan primarily consisted of keeping this conflict from escalating into military intervention, but will that be enough? For all the latest, keep it locked right here at WCN. We'll see you next time.